Prose poetry. Prose poetry is poetry written in prose form instead of verse form, while preserving poetic qualities such as heightened imagery, parataxis, and emotional effects. Characteristics. Prose poetry is written as prose, without the line breaks associated with poetry. However, it makes use of poetic devices such as fragmentation, compression, repetition, rhyme, metaphor, and figures of speech. History. In 17th century Japan, Matsuo Basho originated heibun, a form of prose poetry combining haiku with prose. It is best exemplified by his Bukaku no Hasamichi, in which he used a literary genre of prose and poetry composition of multidimensional writing. In the West, prose poetry originated in early 19th century France and Germany as a reaction against the traditional verse line. The German romantics Jean Paul, Novalis Friedrich Hölderlin, and Heinrich Heine may be seen as precursors of the prose poem. Earlier, 18th century European forerunners of prose poetry had included James Macpherson's translation of Ossian and Évariste de Parny's chansons maigrises. At the time of the prose poem's establishment as a form, French poetry was dominated by the Alexandrine, a strict and demanding form that poets starting with Maurice de Guérin-whose Le Centaure and La Bacchante remain arguably the most powerful prose poems ever written, and Aloysius Bertrand and Gaspard de la Nuit chose, in almost complete isolation. Later Charles Baudelaire, Arthur Rimbaud, and Stéphane Mallarmé followed their example in works like Paris Spleen and Illuminations. The prose poem continued to be written in France into the 20th century by such writers as Max Jacob, Henry Micox, Gertrude Stein, and Francis Ponge. The writings of Syrian poet and writer Francis Marish 1836–73 featured the first examples of prose poetry in modern Arabic literature. From the mid-20th century, the great Arab exponent of prose poetry was the Syrian poet Adunis Ali Ahmad Said Esper, born 1930, a perennial contender for the Nobel Prize in Literature. The modernist poet T.S. Eliot wrote vehemently against prose poems. He added to the debate about what defines the genre, writing in his introduction to Juna Barnes' highly poeticized 1936 novel Nightwood, that it could not be classed as poetic prose as it did not show the rhythm or musical pattern of verse. By contrast, other modernist authors, including Gertrude Stein and Sherwood Anderson, consistently wrote prose poetry. Canadian author Elizabeth Smart's By Grand Central Station, I Sat Down and Wept 1945 is a relatively isolated example of mid-20th century English language poetic prose. Prose poems made a resurgence in the early 1950s and in the 1960s with American poets Allen Ginsberg, Bob Dylan, Jack Kerouac, William S. Burroughs, Russell Edson, Charles Simic, Robert Bly, John Ashbery, and James Wright. Edson worked principally in this form and helped give the prose poem a reputation for surrealist wit. Simic won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry for his 1989 collection, The World Doesn't End. Since the late 1980s, prose poetry has gained in popularity. Journals have begun specializing in prose poems or microfiction. In the United Kingdom, Stride Books published a 1993 anthology of prose poetry, A Curious Architecture.